The story so far. John Carpenter's made Halloween in 1978, a film that made loads of money, everyone loved it, and it kicked off this whole spate of imitators, single-handedly creating what we now refer to as the slasher movie boom. A sequel was made which John Carpenter was basically forced to make, and he decided that he'd use the opportunity to kill off Michael for good. Halloween 2 did well for itself, and when it was time for the inevitable Halloween 3, he decided to make something completely different. There's a lot of reasons why Halloween 3 never really worked when it came out, but the end result was that it didn't do well. John Carpenter didn't really want to make more sequels, and so he was happy to abandon the franchise and to go off and make his own movies that he actually wanted to make. He wasn't in the movie game just for the money, he actually loved the craft itself and was happier doing things that he felt personally passionate about, rather than just churning out product.
I felt like the last few years I've been doing the same area of films over and over again, and I wanted to start trying something new. And it was just an attempt to grow as an artist, I think, more than anything else.
So with the Halloween franchise dead in the water after Halloween 3, we have to ask the question, how did Halloween 4 come to be?
Why now? You waited 10 years. I knew this day would come.
The biggest obstacle to more post-Season of the Witch Halloween movies seemed to be John Carpenter himself. In the end, he actually gave up his rights to make more, handing the reins of the franchise over to moneyman Mustafa Akkad when he was finally fed up of arguing over the future direction of the franchise. And this is the most significant thing to remember about where both Halloween 4 and all future Halloween films are coming from. The first 3 films were all born from the John Carpenter and Deborah Hill School of Filmmaking friends, this kind of creative community which had a certain look and feel and a commonality of approach, and all those films are, to various degrees, movies infused with John Carpenter's filmmaking ethos. Halloween 4 represents a significant turning point in the franchise because it's the point at which creative ownership of the franchise had left John Carpenter and it went on to become something much more straightforwardly and deliberately commercial, very much the antithesis of the original and also to an extent to Halloween 3. After 1987, John Carpenter was no longer involved with the Halloween films to any meaningful degree. As of Halloween 4, the key man in charge was now Mustafa Akkad. And whatever else you want to think of Mustafa Akkad, the most important thing to bear in mind was that he wasn't a filmmaker, he was purely a businessman. A lot of the behind-the-scenes struggles between Akkad and John Carpenter were around ideas. There were a lot of treatments and ideas for sequels in the 5 years between Halloweens 3 and 4, too much to really go into here, but what it basically came down to was that John Carpenter wanted new and original ideas that did interesting things with the IP, usually involving punching up the supernatural aspects that have been hinted at in Halloween 1, moving the story away from simple slasher territory, whereas Mustafa Akkad wanted something that was basically just Halloween 1 again.
So on 4, I took it over and went back to the basics of number 1.
And that's why I'm here to make the argument that, rather than just being a straightforward sequel to Halloween 1 and 2, that Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, is in actual fact a textbook franchise reboot. A new version of an existing property created with the intention of reintroducing core elements, made with an eye towards reinvigorating public interest and capturing an all-new audience, rather than just being an advancement of an existing storyline, like a sequel is, or even just a variation on a central theme. Halloween 4 was never meant to be just another Michael Myers movie, but the first in a line of John Carpenter-less Halloween films to be marketed to the sequel-mad horror fans of the 1980s. That meant reinventing Michael Myers for a new generation, and the best way to do that, according to Mustafa Akkad, was to retell a similar version of the original Halloween story, but with a few subtle tweaks to it that acknowledged that the cinematic landscape had changed in the 10 years since 1978, much in the same way that Halloween 2 acknowledged the rising interest in the slasher subgenre, and Halloween 4 needed not just to work in itself, but it also needed to set up a new approach to the mythology that would allow the Halloween films to become a full-fledged franchise with room for multiple future installments. So the idea for Halloween 4 was to keep things as close to the template of Halloween Part 1 as possible. It opens with Michael Myers escaping from a sanitarium to return to the town of Haddonfield, to pursue a babysitter and the kid that she's looking after, whilst Dr. Loomis intones dire warnings to the local sheriff. Michael relentlessly hunts the babysitter before being thwarted at the last moment. The key differences here are that Michael starts off as a badly burned victim who escapes in an ambulance, before popping his mask back on and just becoming the same pull back and release Terminator killer that we've come to expect. And the main characters this time are Jamie Lloyd, played by Danielle Harris, who is revealed to be a deceased Laurie Strode's daughter, and her adoptive sister Rachel, played by Ellie Cornell, who slips pretty neatly into the Laurie Strode part, even though Michael is actually hunting Jamie this time. There's a few basic tweaks, but to all intents and purposes, the story in Halloween 4 is more or less identical, especially if you choose to compare it with some of the genuinely bizarre versions of Halloween 4 that were being considered prior to this one. It was a film whose central ethos was, okay, you didn't like the last one because it was weird and different, here's literally the first one, but slightly jazzed up. I mean, that's not a bad idea, but the problem is that it's the idea of a money man, of someone that's looked at the profits and formulated the theory that Halloween 2 and 3 did poorer box office than Part 1, therefore let's just stick to what was in Part 1 because that's the stuff that seems to work. There's a certain artistic insincerity about the idea that seems limiting, like reverse engineering something from parts that have proven their value as opposed to creating something organic because you believe in it in its entirety. In a way, this is, especially to outsiders, the biggest problem with the whole Halloween franchise, this way of thinking, because Halloween 4 is the first of 3 films specifically created that do the let's just stick to the original, ignore the stuff we don't like approach. The other 2 examples being, of course, H2O, Halloween 20 years later, and 2018's Halloween. The only difference is that in Halloween 4's case, it's a stylistic thing, but in the other 2 examples, it involved actively binning the other films, which makes it difficult to appreciate the franchise as a whole when you're constantly being told that things in the past don't matter. Here's another film that's just sticking to stuff from the first Halloween film. The problem with that is that the only possible lesson you can learn from it is that sequels suck and that pure imitation is all that the fans really want. But let's get back to 1988 and Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Now that might seem like a clunky title, but it's absolutely 100% there for a reason. It's a statement of intent that guarantees that our boy the Shape is coming back this time, unlike that Halloween 3 shit. That's why Halloween 4 bins the iconic mysterious imagery of the Halloween and Halloween 2 posters and just slaps a big picture of Myers on the cover. The weird thing is, though, that there's 2 ways to look at Halloween 4. One is to do what I've just done, which is to think about what it is, what it represents, and where it's coming from when you realise that it's a movie that's made just to say the Halloween films are back, Michael Myers is back, everything's going to be great, and just reminding us of all the classic Halloween 78 stuff that we love so much. In this respect, Halloween 4 is pretty empty, and nothing to get too excited about. It is, like I said, really the first Halloween film that's just another Halloween film, one that almost entirely blends into the others. But fuck it, if you watch Halloween 4 as a fan, it's great fun. It's a great movie, even if it isn't coming from the best place in the world. It's beautifully shot, it's atmospheric, efficient, and it's got a great cast. In actual fact, I think there's an argument that it's actually got the best cast of any film in the franchise, and yes, that includes Halloween Part 1. See, Halloween 4 isn't great just because Halloween 1 was great, and here's a film doing all that same stuff again. It's a well-made film in its own right. I think that, in a lot of ways, the director of Halloween 4, Dwight Little, is a better, more confident director than Halloween 2's Rick Rosenthal, with a way better understanding of horror and atmosphere. But a lot of the appeal of Halloween 4 does come from the chance to get to see a new take on the stuff that we've all seen before. The difference, though, is the time that it was made. One of the main things that sets Halloween 4 apart from other films of the era, even Halloweens 2 and 3, is that it is deliberately circumspect in its use of violence and gore, the great selling points of a lot of 1980s horror films. That's fine, it works well, and even if the impetus for the decision isn't entirely organic, but more just a case of stylistic unity with Part 1, the end result is something that doesn't feel like it's trying to impress you by being shocking or revolting. And it lets Halloween 4 be more about atmosphere than a series of special effects set pieces. In a lot of ways, Halloween 4 did well for itself in 1988 because it wasn't doing the same things as everyone else. In the mid-1980s, things had changed a lot in the horror genre. The dominant figure of the 80s was, of course, the man we all know as Freddy Krueger, far and away the most iconic scream monster of the decade, and he brought with him a certain sardonic charm that by the 4th installment of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise had morphed into full-on winking at the camera. The trend in mid to late 80s horror was for far more overt comedy, usually ones involving ludicrously excessive gore, stuff like Evil Dead 2 and Reanimator, coupled with the wisecracking antics of the gleefully sadistic Freddy Krueger. There was a definite trend towards aggressively explicit horror films with a raucous, punkish approach to the subject. That's one of the things that you'll notice most about reviews of Halloween 4 in 1988 when it first came out. The sense that we're seeing something that had a strangely old-fashioned charm to it, something that didn't play into the fact that you could get away with being as bloody and violent and hyped up as possible. Once again, Halloween 4 was distinguishing itself by being classier and more sophisticated with its scares, and not by relying on shock. There was a real elegant simplicity to Halloween 4 that set it apart from the anything-goes mayhem of the post-Freddy era of horror when you look at it in the context of the late 80s, whereas if you compare it to the original, the thing that stands out most is how action-orientated it is. There are moments of pure out-and-out horror atmosphere in Halloween 4, coupled with the audience's eagerness to be reintroduced to Michael Myers again, that really just hit the spot. In a way, with the exception of Leatherface, whose own path through various sequels is a lot more complicated, Michael was the first of the wave of slasher villains that had birthed, in effect, the whole 1980s horror boom, so getting a chance to see him returning felt special, like it was a kind of return of the king in a way. I mean, you can't overstate just how much had happened in horror since Michael had last appeared in 1981, with this cool, vibrant Fangoria-reading fan culture that had blossomed and spilled out into the mainstream. Horror was no longer as apologetically minimalist as it had been in the late 70s, and that meant that when Michael finally returned for Halloween 4, he could do so in style, as the conquering hero providing an alternative to the foul-mouthed spoofiness of the 80s gore comedies, a stylish elder statesman to show the imitators how it was done. And it was this power and elegance that were important to Michael's rebranding as a new horror icon for the 1980s, backlit and striking poses, as opposed to the skulking semi-phantom of John Carpenter's film, who was much more a force of pure horror, but never intended to be a marketable anti-hero in the Freddy mould. Just look at how few of the 1970s Halloween advertising actually used pictures of Michael, as opposed to the later 80s stuff. The weird thing is, though, that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of who and what Michael Myers is here that kind of offsets things, and this is one of the main things that, for me, marks Halloween 4 as a pure reboot, and not just a sequel, because there's no denying that in Halloweens 1 and 2, Michael Myers is an ordinary guy with a mask, who operates as a shadowy figure that can subtly rewrite the laws of reality. He's this unkillable force of pure evil in a human shape. He's scary because he's got that he could be anybody under the mask vibe. In Halloween 4 though, he's Jason Voorhees. He's a big, lumbering boogeyman for the post-Terminator generation unused to subtlety of any kind. For some reason, when they were looking for the guy to play Michael in Halloween 4, they specifically went out of their way to get somebody big, somebody over 6 foot tall, and to me, that undercuts a lot of the power of Michael as this sinister force, because it turns him into just a big, lumbering brute who does stuff like this. The point is that in Halloween, and to some extent Halloween 2, Michael didn't need to be a hulking monster. He was scary because he was so ordinary. It's just that fundamentally, the appeal of Halloween has never been that he's a big bruiser that fucks people up because he's so unstoppable. That's what the Friday the 13th films are for, where Jason is just pure brute force, and that's fine, because that's the way those films work, where there's really not a huge amount of room for subtlety, and it's just about these big, bombastic, gory kills. The thing that's so great about Halloween is that it doesn't play that game. It plays something a lot more stripped back, realistic and creepy, where the bogeyman is a faceless everyman morphed into something supernatural, not just a big guy chucking you through windows. To me, that's less scary because it's stuff that feels like it operates on a way more obviously cinematic level, and Halloween 4, for all its finesse, plays its fair share of 1980s action tropes. It's got plenty of gunfire, explosions and action scenes, which make it entertaining in a popcorn blockbuster type way, but as a sequel to John Carpenter's films, even the bigger, louder Halloween 2, it's a bit of a leap. But there's enough that Halloween 4 shares with its predecessors that you're happy to accept that the story they've chosen to tell in Halloween 4 just happens to be a lot bigger and a lot more simplistic in an action-y way. To me, that's just a byproduct of deliberately making a Halloween movie for a more commercial audience, part of that mainstream filtration process by which Carpenter's Halloween was rebooted for the 1980s audiences who are used to more action and bombast. To be honest, I think if Halloween 4 had been just a complete photocopy of Halloween 1, where everything was very realistic and subtle and down to earth, then it just wouldn't have done so well when it came out. The first thing that you're aware of as a producer with an interest in the bottom line, like Mustafa Akkad was, is an awareness of what sells, and to his credit, he didn't morph the franchise into out-and-out Freddy territory, upping the gore or injecting more comedy. He kept things close to Part 1, but injected this bigger, more action-oriented approach to Michael Myers' mayhem that showed the influence of the increasing number of Friday the 13th films. Halloween 4 wasn't just another Halloween sequel, it was clearly intended to be the first of a new wave of John Carpenter-less films, a new franchise that didn't really slot that neatly into parts 1 and 2 considering how different the Michaels of parts 1 and parts 4 are, and again, for a sequel, it really does gloss over the central thrust of parts 1 and 2 by suggesting that after the events of Halloween 2, Laurie Strode, our heroine, had a child and then died, which seems fairly anticlimactic when you followed parts 1 and 2, but less so when you realise that Halloween 4 is attempting to gather in a new wave of fans without that real emotional investment in the earlier installment's central character. The emotional arc of the franchise as a whole isn't that important if you look at Halloween 4 as being the first of a new line of films. It is, I would say, textbook reboot stuff. The only recurring actor in Halloween 4 is Donald Pleasance's Dr. Loomis, who hangs about to give gravitas to the film because of course he's brilliant, but also because he's a vital part of the Halloween machine, because without him you don't get the same sense of building menace and threat to Michael Myers that's so vital to the franchise, that thing that John Kenneth Muir referred to as Loomis functioning as a hype machine. That's the joy of a reboot though. You get the chance to keep the stuff that works, then change up the stuff that doesn't, and Dr. Loomis is irreplaceable. You don't get the chance to deliver those ominous monologues, and you'd lose a lot of time in having to convey afresh the idea that Michael Myers isn't just a dude with a knife and a mask, but something far more deadly. However, there is something slightly different about Dr. Loomis in Halloween 4. He's no longer the morally ambiguous good guy, the counterbalance of Michael Myers' pure evil. He's actually fairly unimportant to the story as a whole, other than that he gets the plot moving faster. He never feels as fresh or as dramatic as he did in Halloween 1, where he was the most heightened element in an otherwise realistic world, just because in Halloween 4, everything else feels so pumped up and overdone. Instead, the opposition to Michael Myers' evil in Halloween 4 are a group of gun-toting rednecks, straight out of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, as opposed to Halloween 1 and 2, where the Van Helsing-Dracula relationship between Loomis and Myers suggested that only somebody like Dr. L, who understood what Michael really was and believed in his evil, could hope to defeat him. Halloween 4 is more simplistic, therefore, and less about this struggle between forces of good and evil. As young Jamie Lloyd is the key to Michael's actions in Part 4, it becomes 100% about her and Michael, which is an uneven relationship given that she can clearly never possess the wherewithal to stand up and fight back against Michael, even in the way that Laurie Strode did in Part 1. That's why the redneck mob feels rather inelegant, a deus ex machina with no personal or emotional investment in the key struggle at the heart of Halloween, as they are really neither a force of good or evil, and that's one of the things that I think doesn't work so well in Part 4, just because Parts 1 and 2 are all about characters, whereas the whole mob angle might work as part of a bigger scale Halloween film, but just doesn't feel as satisfying overall. And as much effort is made in making sure that Halloween 4 feels similar in style to Part 1, there is once again the problem that goes all the way back to the idea that Halloween is a film that works and is scary because there's a definite ambiguity to what's happening, that there's something inherently unexplainable about Michael Myers. Even though explanation has been retroactively added to Halloween Part 1, that doesn't change the fact that, in itself, Halloween 1 is a film about terrifyingly random things happening that don't always make sense. Why does Michael attack Laurie? Why does he stage tableaus of his victims? Even the head cock is disturbing because it's strange. Just what is it that Michael is actually doing? What is he thinking about, and what is he reacting to? One of the greatest things in Halloween is that whole feeling of why is this happening, which is a key component to its overall realism, where things aren't necessarily easily explainable in really obvious terms. Sadly, Halloween 4 has got none of that strangeness or randomness. Michael has been explained into being just another killer, and he always has a definite sense of purpose in Halloween 4, and like John Carpenter's dreaded Halloween 2 plot twist, it's all about the bloodline. That's another key point that suggests Halloween 4 is a reboot, because from Halloween 4 onwards, this idea of Myers as someone obsessed with family features in every single other Mustafa Akkad produced Halloween film, whereas had Carpenter somehow been persuaded to make a Michael Myers sequel, it's almost a given that he'd want to chuck this aspect of it out, given how much he regrets ever making that decision in the first place. To Akkad, however, and his new rebooted Halloween line, this was what the movies were all about. The Michael of Halloween 4 is much closer to his Halloween 2 incarnation in that he's totally focused on doing what he needs to do, which in this case is killing his last surviving relative, a young Jamie Lloyd. I mean, it's clever how he hunts, hacking his way back to Haddonfield, cutting off communications, destroying the power station, massacring the police, and then laying siege to Jamie's house. It's a lot of effort to get to one small girl, but on the level that Halloween 4 operates at, which is as a bigger action movie reskin of the Halloween formula, where things are overplotted instead of elegantly minimalistic like John Carpenter's film, it's pretty cool. But it does paint Michael as something of a strategic genius rather than just a terrifying faceless bogeyman, which makes more sense given the whole idea of Halloween 4 is to rebrand the franchise as having a distinct icon at its centre, which is the key thing if you're going to make a 1980s slasher franchise. And though I think the Michael of Halloween 1 is the perfect horror villain, he's just not one designed to be sold. There's too much mystery to really get a handle on him. The 1980s audiences wanted a villain they could understand and see being badass, and though it's hinted at in Halloween 1 and Halloween 2 that Michael is a dude that understands how to hunt down his prey, the hyper-smart Michael of Part 4 is chilling in his own way, which does set him apart from the pure brute force of Jason Voorhees.
You're talking about him as if he were a human being. That part of him died years ago.
With that said, I think it's time to move on to spoilers. Let's discuss Halloween 4's famous finale, in which young Jamie Lloyd finally gives in to her bloodline and history repeats itself, because in a way, it's one of the most telling and important things about Halloween 4 as a whole, because it reveals so much about the way that the filmmakers were working, their priorities, and the differing ideas about continuity and advancement within the franchise as a whole. On the first pass, it's a cool idea. Michael is dying, he reaches out to Jamie, his niece, there's a moment as their hands touch, and then Uncle Michael gets blasted to hell. Cut to the epilogue, and we get to see an eerily familiar point of view shot. We witness a first person stabbing, then cut to Dr. Loomis screaming as we pull back to reveal Jamie Lloyd standing there covered in blood wearing the same costume as young Michael Myers in Halloween 1. History has repeated itself, and the evil lives on, having found a new form. It's a great twist ending, and the idea that Jamie touching Michael's hand allows the evil inside Michael to transfer to his niece has a certain mystery to it that's one of Halloween 4's most ambitious and original ideas. For scholars of the Halloween franchise, you can trace this central idea of Michael Myers being possessed by an evil that has entered his body to the original Halloween novelization. However, there's a few problems with this ending, some of which aren't entirely the fault of Halloween 4 itself, but more about its overall place in history and what is done with this idea. First up, it's not a key idea of the film, and the fact that this whole subplot is basically packed into the last 5 minutes makes it feel like a bit of a twist for its own sake. There is the suggestion that Jamie is haunted by the spirit of Michael. She is presented to us as a nervous and slightly unstable kid, but really if they'd played more into this idea, then the fact that such a sweet kid as Jamie ultimately is revealed to be evil wouldn't work as such a tremendous sucker punch, a redo of the classic opening reveal of Halloween Part 1. There's a danger that mirroring and drawing parallels ends up feeling a little bit cutesy, but in this case, here's the thing. Jamie, presumably haunted by visions, is drawn to the same clown costume that young Michael wore by the forces in her bloodline. That's a cool idea that sends shivers down your spine, not just a bit of overzealous fan service. However, the problem is that Jamie keeps a shoebox in her room with pictures of her family in it, and for some weird reason that's a little bit awkward to actually explain away, she's got a picture of young Michael aged 6 there, and he's wearing his clown costume. So no part of her ever stops and thinks, oh yeah, this clown costume is the same as the one that my psychopathic uncle wore when he went crazy and started killing people. It annoys me, the whole photo in the box thing, because otherwise it's this cool thing about masks and costumes and identities that's always been a key part of Halloween's mythology, that taps into the childlike notion that putting on a mask allows you to assume a different identity just for the night of Halloween. Jamie is seen as an outsider who gets bullied at school, so the idea that there's just something about her that would invite the evil inside really does work. But it is ultimately a really fun idea, even if they do just push it a little bit too far, just to make sure that the audience knows what's happening. This isn't just a bit of random nitpicking though, it comes back once again to this idea that Halloween 4 is a film that's designed to imitate Part 1. If you look at it from a distance, then the arc of Halloween 4 is that Michael hunts down his niece, presumably to kill her, then at the last minute he is stopped, only for young Jamie to inherit her uncle's evil and become the new incarnation of the Shape. That's a cool story to look at, but the thing is, Halloween 4 is fundamentally concerned with being a reboot of Halloween 1. Therefore, there isn't the room in Halloween 4 for more of a focus on the whole bloodline aspect, or of a character arc for Jamie where she gradually changes into someone willing to accept the evil inside her. It's just a redo of Halloween 1, with a twist ending, and that falls squarely at Mustafa Akkad's door, given how reluctant he was to move the franchise away from being anything other than just the straightforward slasher template of Part 1. A braver, more independently minded or artistically motivated version of Halloween 4 would be much more about the character of Jamie and an understanding of where she's going narratively, as opposed to Akkad's approach, which insisted on familiarity, and that's what really holds Halloween 4 back. The first time you watch Halloween 4, there's an assumption that, okay, you've watched the 1980s redone version of the original Halloween, fine, all familiar, well made, good to see the elements all firmly back in place again, but now, hey, what a great ending, and you wonder, where is it going to go next? Surely in a radically new direction. The franchise has been rebooted, now it's going to go off and do its own thing. That's a story for another time because Halloween 5 is its own thing. But let me just say this, it's also basically a version of Halloween 1 again, as are just about all of the other sequels, and this general reluctance to break new ground narratively and to deliberately stick to formula over pursuit of ideas and new narrative forms kind of holds back a lot of the sequels after this point. But the thing here is that Halloween 5 doesn't really pick up on a lot of what Halloween 4 does, which means that in hindsight there's something quite frustrating about the end of Halloween 4. Arguably the most tantalising plot development in the whole franchise that just doesn't really go anywhere. And that is all down to the fact that from 1988 onwards, the Akkads kept a very tight control of the franchise and seemed to deliberately fight any attempts to shake things up. In a way, yeah, Halloween 4 was never ever going to be the last film in the franchise because it wasn't made that way. Even though the writer, Alan McElroy, didn't really know what was going to happen after the end of Part 4, part of me would have really loved it if this had actually been the last film in the franchise proper, because there's something really poetic and shocking about that Jamie Lloyd finale, this proper ending of sorts to a trilogy of Michael Myers films. But of course, Halloween 4 did really well for itself when it came out, and Halloween 5 was rushed out. But just because the ending wasn't followed up in the best way, doesn't mean that Halloween 4 is any the worst for it. But Halloween 5 was pretty much a given as soon as Mustafa Akkad took control of the franchise and wanted to reimagine the franchise as a series of ongoing films, even before there was ever really a script for Halloween 4. Halloween 4 was always intended to be Halloween 4, which would then be followed by Halloween 5, so the fact that the ending is so definitive and shocking works in its favour, even if it does seem a little irresponsible to have no idea whatsoever what was going to come next. But at the end of the day, Halloween 4 is a film that resonates with fans and generally ends up in the upper echelons of most rankings of the series, because it lines up with a lot of what you'd expect from a Halloween film, done in a stylish and imaginative way. Danielle Harris would kickstart her career as a scream queen, and even at this point, she's a fantastic and likeable actress who, along with Ellie Cornell, are a strong pair of leads.
Jamie, what happened?
It was the Nightmare Man.
What?
He's coming to get me, Rachel.
There's loads to like in Halloween 4, a sturdy retooling of Carpenter's tale of believable suspense into a bigger scale action movie about an unstoppable killer hunting down a vulnerable heroine. In a way, it's John Carpenter's Halloween redone for a popcorn audience. Less often talked about are the major differences with Halloween 4, how it deviates from the formula of the franchise, which I've taken some time to highlight, some for better, some for worse. It's easy to pick holes in any film really when you compare it to Halloween Part 1, just because that's such a perfect encapsulation of the power of auteuring a singular vision, as opposed to the more studio-bred slickness of Halloween 4's approach. But there's enough respect for, and use of, Carpenter's classic elements that means yes, Halloween 4 is a studio reboot of a brilliant IP, brought back to life with the intention of turning the iconic elements and mythology into the groundwork for a franchise that really shouldn't have happened. But still, Halloween 4, even allowing for that, is great fun, one of the best sequels of the 1980s. Mustafa Akkad might have been first and foremost a money man, but he also understood what worked so well about the original film, and tried his best to mimic it and update it for the 1980s audiences, using the tools of the studio system, and he really did a great job, all things considered.
And my favorite is number 4, of course, always. That's the big hit.
It's just a shame that he would always remain somebody afraid to change things up, because you can reboot and imitate once to start things over, but what you can't do is to build a franchise out of nothing but that. Halloween had returned with a bang. The future of the newly rebooted franchise, though, was already looking rocky.
I prayed that he would burn in hell, but in my heart, I knew that hell would not have him.
It's what we're here for.
Rescue cats.
Find dogs.
That's a job.
And we love it.